Yeah, our goal is to be your favorite part of your journey to pregnancy. I mean, second to obviously the delivery of your baby. Like we can't compete with that.
Welcome to the Surrogacy Scoop, a podcast brought to you by Patriot Conceptions, where we demystify the world of surrogacy from the clinical, family, and surrogate perspective. I'm your host, CJ, and today I'm joined by Noor Siddiqui, CEO of Orchid. Orchid is a reproductive technology company working to give everyone the ability to have a healthy child. They are doing the difficult work of measuring and mitigating genetic risk so the next generation can concentrate on life, not managing a disease. Noor aims to equip couples with genetic insight to better predict and understand potential health risks for their future children. Welcome to the show, Noor.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am so excited to learn more about you today, learn more about Orchid. I feel like this is something our audience is going to be super interested in. But before I get ahead of myself, tell us a little bit about your journey to where you are today as the CEO of Orchid.
Sure. Yeah. So I've always been really interested in computational genomics. So when I was at Stanford, I was working in a lot of different AI labs. I was working on computer vision. I was working on deep learning for transcription factor binding. I was building models for risk prediction. And I think the main thing that I was really excited about is this idea that genetics has kind of become a computational science, right? So now we have hundreds of thousands of individuals who've been sequenced. So you have their sequence data paired with their medical records. So now kind of the promise of the Human Genome Project, which started in the year 2000, and it cost a few $1 billion to get the first human genome sequence. And there was kind of this really, the Clinton, global initiative. There's a lot of excitement around, how is, the sequencing of the human genome going to unlock insights, and how is it going to help change our management of disease? So what happened is that over these last 20 years, sequencing got a lot cheaper, and these databases finally got populated, right? So what's really exciting about being able to have that data is that now geneticists all around the world have collaborated and now have cataloged over 7,000 genetic diseases, right? So before we didn't know, why, something was happening, and now we actually know. We've pinpointed the exact molecular cause. In addition to that, from the machine learning side, we can now quantify genetic susceptibility to disease. So there's kind of two different categories of genetic disease. There's monogenic, meaning there's a single gene that is mutated, or there's a variant that causes disease, and the other side is polygenic, meaning there's anywhere from thousands to millions of variants that are driving risk for disease. So that's kind of the research that I was doing at Stanford, is how do you build models for conditions like schizophrenia or heart disease or diabetes, where there's not just one gene, but there's the cumulative risk factors of many thousands of variants. So that's kind of like the academic background and the reason why I got excited about what we're doing at Orchid. And then in terms of kind of more just like a personal perspective, my mom had this condition called retinitis pigmentosa. And she started, unfortunately, progressively going blind in her 30s. So she started by losing her night vision, then she lost her peripheral vision, and then, progressively as the retina degraded over time, she lost more and more of her vision. So that was really just a heartbreaking thing to watch. Someone who's so, independent and just so much fire and energy for life, unfortunately get something, so critical like vision, hijacked and derailed. And just like this progressive loss is sort of like you feel, more and more of your independence, ripping away from you over time. So because of that, and kind of when I was doing this research, I kind of was thinking more concretely about getting engaged and getting married, and sort of what was sort of the most important thing for me for the next step. And it was sort of like, I wanted to be able to screen my embryos, and I wanted to be able to mitigate the chance that, blindness or anything else that's sort of genetic in nature could affect my mom. Because the thing that's kind of crazy about the world is that there's this genetic lottery that happens, right? It's just completely by chance, whether, you and I get to see or hear, or whether we have all of our limbs, or whether we have, a heart that is missing something critical, like a valve. So there's basically this lottery that happens that is, I think, incredibly unfair. And I think it's really cool to be able to finally have kind of gotten to the other side where, we've built now this, really revolutionary product that allows parents to have 100 times the information about their embryos compared to what they had before. So it's really cool to kind of have that gone that full circle moment from like, being really excited about the promise to actually, going into the lab and building something fundamentally new, and being able to test my own embryos, being able to test, just obviously embryos from families around the country, and to actually see babies being born is obviously the best possible email that could be in my inbox.
Wow. First off, thank you for taking us through that whole journey. There's so much that I find so interesting about these conversations. This is a surrogacy related podcast, but also just alternative family building kind of podcast. And something that keeps coming up in all of these conversations is just that empathy piece, how much personal connection just influences this field and is such a core to this field. So I'm not surprised at all to hear that this kind of was inspired, at least part, by your mom and that really close family experience. Yeah, I just imagine that continues to inspire your work today.
Yeah, I just think it's honestly, I mean, my mom's really inspiring, but I think all the patients that we see are really inspiring too, right? They're really heroic. They've overcome a lot, right? They have a first child with a really severe neurodevelopmental disorder, or they're a caregiver for a parent or a loved one that's suffering, or they themselves have a condition like schizophrenia or diabetes or heart disease or, inflammatory bowel disease or whatever it is, and they don't want their child to be affected in the same way. And I think that that's just showing so much love and so much care for your child before they even exist, to be able to scan and to take the maximum amount of risk off of the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, it's like, yeah, so much of it just really comes and sticks with that empathy piece. And so many of the conversations too around embryo testing. We just had an embryologist on the podcast. I believe that's the episode before this one. So we're really kind of working through all the stages of what does that look like? What does that process looks like? And I think that gives us a good transition into kind of talking more about the meat of Orchid, what you're doing every day, and maybe how that relates to our audience. Something like surrogacy, how often is that a part of Orchid's day-to-day operations, or how often are you seeing cases like in that way?
Oh, with patients who are hiring gestational carriers, yeah, it's very common. I mean, I don't know the exact percentage of cases that involve surrogacy, but I think it's quite normal. The team is very well versed in how to handle those situations. I mean, I think that especially when you have a donor gametes, egg or sperm, or a surrogate involved, I think that there's already much more time, much more energy, much more money going into the process. So I think that those situations, it's actually, I think, more common for people to choose Orchid, because again, it's sort of like, you have a couple of different embryo testing options, right? You have PGTA that's just going to look at chromosomes. You have PGTM that's just going to look at one single gene. Both of these testing technologies are going to look at less than 1% of the genome, right? So 99% of the genome is how much Orchid covers. We're talking about 100 times more data. So we're scanning for over 1,200 diseases that cause birth defects, heart defects, skeletal defects, pediatric cancers, adult onset cancers, neurodevelopmental disorders, complex conditions like heart disease and bipolar and schizophrenia. So I think that when you have that amount of energy and planning going into the process, I think that everyone wants to make sure that we're really maximizing the chance that that child is healthy. Because I mean, the most the saddest outcome is when you get a positive pregnancy test, and then the fetal, you do the ultrasound and you see a fetal anomaly, right? Or unfortunately, when that child is born, and then there was a previously unknown genetic issue that's discovered. So we really like to be partnered with those families as early as possible, so that they can go into that decision with the maximum amount of information for this super important decision.
And maybe let's kind of go through some, I don't know, action steps, or what somebody who is very surface level interested in Orchid, looking to get involved, what kind of specific information would a client need to provide when they are initiating genetic testing?
Yeah, so if you want to, work with Orchid and get whole genome data on your embryos, where you can really understand, 100 times what the other testing options can tell you, the best thing to do is just go to our website, orchidhealth.com, and reach out to one of our genetic counselors. So you can schedule same day or certainly same week with them, and then they'll do a really comprehensive counseling and family history analysis with you, if that's something that you're interested in. And yeah, we're now nationwide. So there's IVF centers across the country that we already work with, that we've already onboarded, that we already have a relationship with. But we also onboard IVF centers depending on patient interest, right? So sometimes, there's just a new center that or a new doctor that a patient is really enamored with, and we're totally happy to do that coordination on the patient's behalf. So really, it's just about going to our website, orchidhealth.com, and then just connecting with a genetic counselor, and then we kind of coordinate with your doctor and handle everything from there. And we even talk to patients even earlier than that, who are sort of in the IVF consideration phase, where it really is across the board. It's everywhere from someone is in cycle, they're creating embryos in a week, all the way to people are 6 months, 9 months out from even making the decision about which IVF center that they want to work with, or if they want to conceive the traditional way, old-fashioned way at home, or if they want to use advanced reproductive technology. So we really kind of see ourselves as like, if you're anywhere on the journey of thinking about having kids, we're totally happy to take your call and to try to understand how we can help. Because yeah, I mean, obviously like everyone who's at Orchid is here for like a very specific and personal reason, which is that they want to help as many people have healthy babies as possible. So if you're in that moment, we'd love to talk to you, and we'd love to just learn more about where you're at and how we can help.
Awesome. That is really helpful, especially knowing that it is an open conversation at various different stages. Obviously, we will have all information to get to Orchid's website, how you reach out. That'll absolutely be in our show notes, so all of our listeners can go there. You mentioned connecting with the doctors, genetic counselors. From Orchid's perspective, you don't employ any doctors. You're not directly involved with any practices?
Yeah, that's correct. We employ genetic counselors. So there are people who are specifically trained in our testing to understand whole genome. So whole genome testing is much more advanced and much more complex than the simpler testing that looks at a smaller number of conditions. So we do. I've personally interviewed over 100 genetic counselors for every role that we filled. So we're very, very particular about who we choose, and really proud to report that they're both incredibly empathetic, but also really quantitative. They're really well versed on the latest research. They do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of just like really doing research on the behalf of patients to make sure that all their questions are answered.
Awesome. Yeah, we did our last episode too. Learned a lot about genetic counselors, their incredible work communicating in between all the different people involved in the journey, a lot of different phases, obviously, as we've discussed as well. So we're a little bit familiar with that realm of things. Maybe let's talk a little bit, or maybe gain a little insight into the operations of Orchid and maybe how that is from the patient side. Maybe this is outside of your wheelhouse, but I'll still ask it anyways. What is the sample collection process, or what kind of samples are collected?
Yeah. So basically, let's say just kind of walk you through the journey. So you meet with one of Orchid's genetic counselors, you choose to work with Orchid. So that genetic counselor will help your physician order the correct testing that you wanted. Then the next step is that the embryologist who's handling your embryos. So kind of the embryo creation process is that you have your egg retrieval, your eggs are in a petri dish, and embryologist goes and fishes out those eggs, fertilizes it with the sperm source of choice. And then you have embryos. Those embryos grow for 5 days. On day 5, that embryo is about 125 cells. And then the embryologist sends about 3 to 5 of those cells to Orchid's lab for analysis. So that's kind of where Orchid fits in, is that we train your doctor's embryologist on a very specific cell collection or biopsy collection procedure. So yeah, the technology that we developed, was developed by a ton of researchers who trained at Stanford. And it's basically the first in the world that has this capability to actually get whole genome data or 100x the data off of embryo. So it is a very specialized procedure, but yeah, embryologists all around the country do understand how to do the sample collection approach. And before we ever accept any patient samples, we actually work with your IVF center to make sure that we do it on sort of test or donated embryos that have been donated for research, to make sure that all the quality metrics are met for the samples before we receive patient samples. So all that coordination happens kind of behind the scenes, but is something that we have really refined and are really excited to see how well embryologists are performing these procedures.
And something else that I kind of picked up as you were saying, and also something that comes up in these conversations a lot, is how unique each patient or customer, whatever kind of language we want to use for that, their journey is. Working one-on-one with a genetic counselor, that genetic counselor talking to your IVF doctor, there's not really a cookie cutter way to go about these things. And it really sounds like that's something that at least is very central to Orchid's methodology.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, there's a lot of, just nuance to this type of testing. And I think that it's really just important to, have a really talented team behind you as you're going through it that really understands the genetics, that understands legal aspects, that understands the emotional aspects. And just feel really proud of the team really being able to support patients who are going through this on, every different side of that. Obviously, the expertise is on the, genetics and on the embryo reports. We do think that those are, the best in the world, the most information that you can get. So yeah, it is really just, rewarding and fun to kind of see people come out the other side with babies in arm and just kind of happy having gone through the process and really feeling like they understood what was going on every step of the way, because it can be, overwhelming if it's something that you haven't done before or that you weren't expecting to do at all.
Absolutely. And there's so many unexpected things, can do as much research as you want, but still the surrogacy journey or the IVF journey, or even just, freezing or having your embryos looked at, there's so many things that can come up. There's so many things that you can't be 100% prepared for. And so having the right people in the right place that are smart enough that can deliver the information in the way you need it, that is so crucial. And again, that's come up in a lot of these conversations. So it's a nice through line to have it come through with Orchid as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So, kind of going back on the going through the patient journey experience, how long is the typical turnaround time for test results?
Yeah, so basically, test results are, from the day that we receive your embryos to the day that you receive a report and your physician receives a report is usually under 21 days. We always like to exceed expectations, but it's about 21 days. We do offer a lot of other additional services beyond the embryo reporting, depending on the patient's preferences. So we can do maternity and paternity confirmation. So if parents choose to submit saliva samples, we can assure that the egg source and the sperm source match what was expected. It could just be, again, another layer of assurance when sometimes, you have gametes and embryos that are, crossing state lines. And, I think there's a lot of just anxiety and fear around something like that. And we also return results on parents if they're interested, right? So if parents are interested in learning their cancer risk status or their risk scores for any of these diseases, that's also something that can be provided, around the same turnaround time. It's just the intended parents just need to let us know upfront that they're interested in that type of analysis, and then they can all kind of be returned together with the embryo reports.
That is that is so fascinating. I'm like personally finding this really interesting. I feel like there's like a million different like rabbit holes we could go down right now.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. I really never considered the additional testing that you can do. I imagine that, it can kind of impact turnaround time and things like that, but having that as an option is just so fascinating. And I imagine that that really excites people as well when they are learning about it coming in the orchid sphere. You talked about it a little bit previously. We've talked about it over and over again, the just immense value and the increase in the amount of data. I think you said 100 times, is that's what Orchid provides. What kind of, I guess, technology is behind that, and how would that differ from the other kinds of genetic testing that you mentioned earlier that maybe only give you 1% of what's really going on?
Yeah, so the way that you can think about PGTA testing is it's kind of like you're looking at chapters in a book, right? So 23andMe, 23 pairs of chromosomes. So chromosomes are these really large structures. So the way that you can kind of think about it is that they're doing spell check on the table of contents, but they're not actually looking at the rest of the book, right? So what Orchid is doing is instead of just looking at that one page, that table of contents, is actually able to do spell check on the entire book. And then the way that you can think about kind of the constraints in this specific setting is that with an embryo, you have a really small amount of DNA, right? So the DNA is in the nucleus. You only have about 4 or 5 cells. So you have about 30 picograms of DNA. So you have 10,000 times less DNA than the amount of DNA that you would have in a blood or saliva sample. So with that really tiny amount of DNA, you can kind of think of it as, let's say you have a really limited amount of ink. If you had a really limited amount of ink, you might only be able to print the table of contents, and you wouldn't be able to print, that entire book that might have 3 billion letters or 1,000 pages to continue the book analogy. So that's kind of the limitation of the older technology, is that because there's a really small quantity of DNA, they can only tell you about a few things because they consume all of that DNA material in that analysis. So that's really where the innovation around Orchid comes in, is that we have a new chemistry and a new computational approach that allows us to get whole genome data to get 100 times the data off of those embryos. So I think the reason why, again, that's really powerful is that over the last 20 years, geneticists have cataloged the causes of so many different diseases. So a lot of people don't know that there's actually genetic forms of autism like Rett syndrome, right? So it's not the case that you can take all of the risk away, but you can take the known genetic forms of risk away, right? So similarly for cancer, we now know about genetic forms of pediatric cancer like retinoblastoma or Li-Fraumeni syndrome, right? And we also know about genetic causes of adult onset cancers, everything from colon cancer to breast cancer. So we've been really surprised to see that, parents might not actually know that the symptoms that they have are genetic. And then we end up screening their embryos and end up being able to find out, more information about mom or dad in the process. So Yeah, I think the information is, yeah, it's really exciting and honestly kind of sci-fi to be able to have that amount of information before you're even pregnant. So yeah, I think there's definitely been a lot of movies and, prognostications and, books about, what will happen and how the world changes when we have this amount of information. But for me personally, I'm really excited because I think it gives parents a lot more freedom and a lot more control because, yeah, we just personally see so many families where, they didn't want to have a kid because they were worried that they were going to suffer from the same condition that their sibling had or that they themselves had. And being able to kind of reduce the amount of genetic privilege or the impact of the genetic lottery in the world, this idea that, everyone gets a better chance at living a full and healthy life is something that I think is really deeply ingrained in the public consciousness and is something that I think, every parent wants. Every parent wants, their child's life to be better than theirs. And for me personally, I think that, doing embryo screening was sort of the most important parenting decision I'm ever going to make, right? Like, the genetics of my child is going to impact more. Whether they get pediatric cancer or whether they go blind is obviously going to be a bigger impact on their life than, which preschool I send them to or whether they have organic food. I mean, obviously I'm actually pro organic food, but I think it's honestly pretty, I don't think people really think about it often, just like how much their genome impacts their life. It's like most of us, I think, are just living in this bubble. We're really lucky that, we don't, we have bones that work. We have, bodies that are fully intact. And it's like really, you know what I mean? I think it's like it causes getting sick or even getting a paper cut to realize that, just how blessed we all are that we didn't get a typo at one of those critical points where, protein breaks and then there's sort of a cascade of sort of severe effects on the other side that, modern medicine is amazing, right? Like we invented IVF and we figured out how to do surrogacy and things like that. But unfortunately, for the vast majority of genetic diseases, 95% of genetic rare diseases, there's no treatment, there's no cure, right? So it's like there's a really small set of things that, medicine has been able to cure, right? Like we did, we eradicated smallpox with the smallpox vaccine and we eradicated polio with the polio vaccine. And I think that now parents have, more power than they've ever had before to be able to eradicate genetic disease and to mitigate the chance that their child's affected by, not just one, but, thousands of things simultaneously.
That's a really good point. It's kind of one of those things, almost a little bit like surrogacy, that unless it directly impacts you or somebody that or love, it's not really something that you're going to think about. But information like this in companies like Orchid that are able to provide a service to not only mitigate that, but also just ensure health in the future, I think that's really important. And I think that's why, getting on the podcast and sharing this kind of information with potential intended parents is so valuable because that information piece and just being aware of it impacts so much. It can really make a big change.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, yeah, especially for families in this setting, it's just like, there's so much planning going into it. So I think that orientation of planning is actually comes quite naturally.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, especially people who are interested or for whatever reason doing IVF or, alternative forms of family building. Yeah, there's a lot of planning. You're probably thinking about things a lot harder than other people in different situations. So I definitely hear
Yeah.
you
And
there.
also like to point out, because sometimes people like to say, oh, like, reporters sometimes be like, oh, there's like less love in like a baby born in a lab versus in a baby born at home. And I'm kind of like, I think it's the exact opposite, right? Like it's someone who, went through so much and basically went through so much planning and so much organization and so much physical effort and talked to so many specialists to make sure that it was possible for this child to exist at all and to have the best start in life. Like, I mean, I think that's kind of the maximum expression of love. So I think, what we're doing with Orchid, I think is really along the similar lines. Is sort of like, I think it's really, an expression of the maximum amount of love for parents to take this much care and consideration for this process, because it's sort of like, yeah, when you're thinking about the health outcomes for a child and you're thinking about how do you make sure that they get the best start in life, and when it's so difficult to conceive and being able to go through all of that to get to the other side to actually have this baby, I mean, that baby is, I don't know, I would say they're more loved than any other baby. They're more wanted than any other baby.
I completely agree, especially after learning so much and speaking to so many different people throughout the surrogacy process. There's so much trust that you have to have as a parent in that situation. You're letting so many people into your family building, and the ability to have and do all that, it's really powerful. And yeah, I completely agree. There's so much love that goes into it. It really is incredible from so many different angles and perspectives. We've talked a little bit about well, we did talk a little bit about the how you receive reports, that kind of stuff. Maybe what happens if an embryo is reported to have a genetic disorder?
Yeah, so it's kind of similar to if you get an aneuploid embryo, right? So if an embryo has an abnormal number of chromosomes, then you wouldn't want to transfer that embryo because it's most likely incompatible with life, right? So remember we have talked about those chapters. So if you have an extra chapter or a missing chapter, the vast majority of the time that's not going to result in a healthy pregnancy. So it really depends on what the parents want reported, right? So if they only want, lethal infant onset conditions reported, those are the only ones we'll report. If they also want childhood and adult onset conditions reported, we'll report those. But yeah, generally in terms of what decision that they want to make once they have the data, it's up to them and their clinical team. So for example, if it's something adult onset like, BRCA or Alzheimer's risk, sometimes there's a different conversation than something where it's, a terminal illness that's going to affect a child within the first 5 years of life, right? So there's different considerations depending on what type of genetic anomaly is detected. But that's something where there's a really deep counseling discussion with, Orchid's genetic counselor, that our genetic counselor interfaces with your physician and their clinical team. So you really have a lot of support in making that decision, but it's also not something that we don't dictate, obviously, which embryo to transfer, right? And it's the parents' decision, what risks they're comfortable with and what risks they want to try to mitigate for for their transfer.
Hmm. And maybe as we're kind of thinking and talking about those test results, different, options that people can opt in or out of regarding those testing results, what is or how does Orchid ensue? How does Orchid ensure confidentiality and security when, we're sharing patient data between multiple different channels, multiple different people?
Yeah. So obviously that's extremely critical. So we actually work with a lot of really, high net worth individuals and people who, really don't want to have, their personal information in the press or in the news. And I think that, yeah, because of that, we've been really careful to develop a lot of procedures so that all the information is anonymized at every single step of the stage except where necessary. So obviously the embryologist needs to know, um, you know, the identity of the patient in order to transfer their embryos and to receive the report. But even within Orchid, as few people as are absolutely necessary actually see any identifying information. And obviously we have the highest possible medical grade security standards to make sure that all that data is protected and only visible to the parties who need to see it.
I ask because I'm sure that that peace of mind piece is just so critical to clients, and especially as you just mentioned in the beginning, the higher net worth or people who maybe have social status. Everybody needs to have access to this care, and everybody needs to have the security that all of their data and health information is going to be kept private.
Yeah, absolutely. We treat everyone like a celebrity at Orchid.
That's
Everyone
awesome.
everyone gets a celebrity treatment, and everyone is treated as the same level of we assume that there's a reporter after your story, so we make sure no one knows. It's just between you and your doctor, and I think that yeah, I mean it's a very fortunate position to be in, right? Because people are coming to us, they might not have talked to family about this, potential pregnancy. They might not have talked to their employer, right? So I mean, it's obviously really important that this information stays between, the intended parties and that if there's any disclosure outside of those parties that's explicitly signed off by the intended parents. I mean, I think that, yeah, I would say that's table stakes and that's something that we like to exceed the expected standard there.
Yeah, that insight is so valuable. And yeah, it's very crucial to something like this, but it's also really awesome and important to hear that that is also a very crucial and central part of Orchid's day-to-day um, activities. Maybe as we kind of wind down our potential patient experience, what are maybe some common challenges that clients face during the genetic testing process, and how does Orchid help to address them?
Honestly, we try to really minimize any challenges. I mean, we can really configure anything to be what's most convenient for the family, right? So we've sent phlebotomists to people's homes, we've sent
Hmm.
saliva collection to people's homes. Yeah, we really like to make it as easy as possible for surrogate, any egg donor, any sperm donor, any intended parents to get access to whatever genetic testing is going to be useful and pertinent for their cycle. So yeah, we like to avoid challenges, to be totally honest. So we like to make things super easy. We like people, I mean, yeah, a lot of patients come away saying like, "Hey, this was our favorite part of the process. Like, we loved talking to your team. We loved how fast it was. We love how we were notified so much of the process." So, yeah, our goal is to be your favorite part of your journey to pregnancy. I mean, second to obviously the delivery of your baby. Like, we can't compete with that.
Yeah.
But second to that, that's our goal.
That is such a great message, aiming to the best part of the journey. I honestly think that's a really incredible way to kind of land this here. As we, wrap up, final words, is there anything that you would want to share with our audience, again, of mostly interested intended parents, interested surrogates or egg donors, from your perspective as an innovator in this field?
Yeah, I mean, just congratulations. I mean, I am, so in awe of every parent or anyone on the journey to parenthood. And I think that, yeah, like I was saying earlier, I think that it expresses the maximum amount of love to have kids this way. So I just feel, really jealous, and excited for your kiddos because they're going to have parents who wanted them so bad and who, went through, ran through every brick wall to make sure that that happened. So yeah, congratulations for being, on this journey. And I'm really excited, for you guys to have hopefully the outcome that you guys are hoping for.
Awesome. Those are perfect parting words, I think. We'll absolutely have links for how to reach Orchid, orchidhealth.com. Are you anywhere else? Is Orchid on any other social media platforms?
No, that's great. Yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you again, Noor, for your time today, and we hope to hear you on the next episode.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Surrogacy Scoop, and I hope you found value in this meaningful conversation. For all resources mentioned in the episode, or to connect with Patriot Conceptions online, visit the description. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast hosting platform, and share this episode with those in your life who may be interested in getting involved.